Hey there, Hal here. Welcome to part 2 of my Raider guide. In part 1 we've tackled the most important subject of this tutorial series, the raiding techniques you can use to become a feared robber baron, just like this right here. Today we'll talk about less important stuff such as the rogue build that I recommend, the skills I focus on, the perks I aim to unlock, and the training regimen you'll be putting your character through in order to obtain those perks. Basically, parts 2 and 3 are going to provide diminishing returns to veteran Bannerlords who may already be familiar with all I'm about to say, but who knows? Stick around and maybe you'll learn something new. But Calradia is getting a constant influx of immigrants, and if you are among the new arrivals who came here to culturally enrich our beautiful continent, my lessons will help you better integrate to our way of life. With that out of the way, let's begin by talking about my Raider build, which by the way, is not set in stone. You can feel free to make any modifications your heart desires. For example, I personally use crossbows because they're more often associated with unsavory characters, but you can use bows if you prefer. Do what you want cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate. So the first thing you do when creating a new character is choosing his culture. This comes down to personal preference, and my preference is Botanian because forests are everywhere, and the extra mobility comes in handy when ambushing caravans. Then I selected these background options because they provide a nice balance of cunning and endurance without wasting too many focus points into useless skills. If you play on Sandbox, you get additional attribute and focus points depending on the age of your character, and of course, as you level up, you gain even more of those points, so here's how I spend them. In regards to attributes, my very first point goes into Vigor because without it, it will be nearly impossible to obtain this perk in one-handed. Then I prioritize Cunning until it's fully maxed out, in order to raise the learning limit of the Roguery skill. Once that's done, the rest of my attribute points are assigned to Endurance because Athletics is, or rather used to be, of utmost importance to our build, and to some small degree, Smithing, although not for the reasons you think. If you somehow manage to get both Endurance and Cunning to 10, you can spend the next points wherever you want, although I never got that far. As for skills, this is where things start getting convoluted, so I'm gonna do my best to KISS. As such, I'll divide all of these into core skills, support skills, and auxiliary skills, just as I did in my trader build video, but those are just buzzwords that don't mean much in the grand scheme of things. To clarify, core skills define our character, support skills help his development, and auxiliaries are there to provide small bonuses with a minimal investment of only one focus point. One of the auxiliary skills that needs your immediate attention is Medicine, because its first perk is too important to skip, even if you recruit a companion skilled in surgery. To demonstrate this perk's importance, let's assume you're trying to squeeze a bunch of peasants. As you know, this technique requires you to launch multiple attacks in order to squeeze more loot out of your victims. But if the yokels throw more stones than you can handle and you get KO'd, you'll be out of commission until your health regenerates to 20%, so in your second attack you'll have to send your men to fight without you. Because you couldn't control that fight, there won't be a third raid, so you won't be able to squeeze too much loot out of them. But if you've taken your preventive medicine, you'll instantly heal 30% of your missing health after each battle, essentially eliminating the downtime in between fights and allowing you to conduct your second and third and fourth attacks without any issues, even if you get bonked every time. It's honestly one of the best perks in the game, and in order to get it, many of your own soldiers will have to die to provide you with free anatomy lessons. But that is a sacrifice you're willing to make. After you get your doctorate, find yourself a skilled medic and assign him the role of party surgeon. Your next few focus points should go into what used to be the most important skill to our character: Athletics. I can no longer wholeheartedly recommend that you focus on this skill. Even though in my original script, which was written prior to patch 1.5.10, I sung praises to Athletics because it transformed me into a god of war. This is how my character was moving in patch 1.5.9 with only 150 Athletics, while wearing the heaviest armor. And this is how he moves now with 250 Athletics in this skill, all these perks unlocked, and 30 fewer pounds of gear. Training your athletics is rather intense, and I'll still give you some tips on how to do it, but nowadays, your reward for 10 hours of grinding is the amazing ability to walk at the breakneck speed of a geriatric with osteoporosis. It looks like in their infinite wisdom, Tailworlds made another aspect of their game unfun, just like they did with trading. But at the very least, this new patch allows you to more reliably develop your skills, as their learning rate no longer decreases as you level up. And who knows, perhaps in the future, athletics will become useful again. To be fair, running like Usain Bolt with only 150 athletics was rather overpowered prior to this nerf. But it would have been nice if the same speed was achievable if you took the time to maximize this skill. In case it wasn't clear, athletics is a core skill. Well, it used to be. Now it's kind of optional, but if you're willing to go through the grind and invest 5 focus points into it, you will also need to maximize one-handed and become fleet-footed. This will be unachievable if your vigor isn't also developed a little, but that can be done without spending more than 1 attribute point if you take this perk in athletics and this other perk in smithing. These skills also have perks that improve your endurance, which further raises the learning limit of your athletics, which further allows you to train it and maximize your movement speed to match that of an average, albeit out of shape middle-aged human. It's not much, but hey, it's an upgrade. Oh, and just to clarify, we don't take smithing to craft ridiculously overpriced swords so that we can make money. If weaponsmithing is your career choice, go ahead, I won't stop you, but for me, it makes no sense for old town merchants to pool all their money together to purchase a single sword. Because selling forged weapons spoils my raider gameplay, I choose not to do it, but I still take smithing for these perks, to boost my endurance and vigor, as well as for the ability to craft custom weapons instead of purchasing the garbage available in shops. Okay, so athletics, one-handed, and to some degree smithing are considered to be core skills, but only if you want to become somewhat competent at fighting on foot. Otherwise, they're entirely optional. What's not optional is that you put 5 whole focus points into Roguery, which coincidentally happens to be the namesake of our character. To be honest, this skill is rather obsolete in the game's current state, but even so, Roguery still has some perks that make a raider's life easier. Here's the thing though, even though this is the most important core skill, giving it 5 focus points is not a matter of urgency because it's pretty difficult to train early on. You're better off investing your first focus points into auxiliary skills or combat abilities, and only putting 1 focus point into this skill whenever you see it approaching its learning limit to prevent it from stalling. Just make sure your roguery is at full focus by the time you reach level 20, because once that threshold is passed, it'll get a bit difficult to level up and gain additional points. Another core skill that needs to be at max focus before level 20 is leadership. This one has many useful perks, but the one we need the most is Veteran's Respect, which allows you to train bandit troops into elites. With that said, leadership is impossible to train until you either join an existing kingdom, which isn't very gangsta of you, or creating your own. We'll talk about training this skill when the time comes. For now, all you need to know is that it cannot be developed until the late game. The third skill that kinda needs to be maxed before 20, but at the same time is entirely optional, is Stewardship. This is a support skill with some benefits, but it's an all or nothing kind of deal. I'll tell you what its benefits are and then you can decide if it's worth the 5 focus points. First of all, it's super easy to train because as long as your soldiers have a varied diet, this skill will passively increase. As it does, your main level will also increase and allow you to gain more attribute and focus points down the line. In addition to that, some of its perks are quite useful but only take effect on your main character. And finally, Stewardship increases the size of your party. This is also the case if you assign a companion to be the steward of your group, but if he dies in battle, your party size will take a hit until you either find or train a suitable replacement. If you are your own steward, you don't risk that happening to you. Maybe those benefits are not worth the 5 focus points for you, in which case you'd best open your encyclopedia and search for a swift, spice vendor, or wanderer companions. They usually have a well-developed stewardship and are able to properly manage your party, but do try to keep them out of harm's way. But before you spend points on rogue, leader, or steward skills, you'd best prioritize your fighting abilities. Athletics, if you chose to focus on it, could be considered a combat skill, but speed is worthless if all you do is flail your arms around, so you're gonna need some steel. If you're a
raider, legendary.
You might be tempted to use a two-handed axe. I know, I gave in to temptation and even invested 5 focus points into this skill, only to realize that was kind of a waste. You see, the reason I went all in was to unlock this perk and deflect arrows, but that did not work as advertised. It did, however, work as expected, and I got a few arrows embedded in my chest. Initially, I thought it's because I tried using a battle axe to block the projectiles when the perk's description clearly states you need to use swords. But even after switching to a claymore, the result was the same. I got a few fine additions to my collection of scars. If you want to use two-handers, I'm not gonna stop you. But a rogue's main fighting skill is one-handed, and as I've stated earlier, it's crucial that you invest 5 focus points into it if you're trying to maximize your running speed. And even if you didn't bother with athletics, the one-handed skill will still need 3 focus points put into it. But why? You could not live with your own failure. Where did that bring you? Back to me. Because arrows are the bane of my existence and I have to use a shield every time I face off against archers. And last I checked, shields can only be paired with one-handers, therefore, that's the skill we must invest at least 3 focus points into in order to unlock the first 4 perks, which are amazing for a rogue. Basher allows you to stagger enemies for longer, Swift Strike improves your attack speed, Shield Bearer makes you faster by reducing the weight of your buckler, and Duelist significantly boosts your damage when you wield a sword without a shield. Now this last one might seem confusing, since the main reason we focused on one-handed weapons was to pair them with a scutum, so why bother with it? Because every once in a while, a rogue's job involves causing a bit of mischief inside the cities he sneaks into. Unfortunately, battlefield weapons such as claymores or shields are not allowed within city limits. Only knives and small swords, which are not the sharpest tools in the sheath. As such, being a capable duelist gives you an edge when you find yourself in the middle of a gang war. After you put 3 FPs into the one-handed skill, you must decide whether you'd like to use another weapon when you're not fighting archers. Maybe a two-handed axe to sweep your enemies off their feet? Or a Ronfire to crush the shields and helmets of those annoying bastards who think they own the castle they're defending. If so, you're free to put 2 focus points into either polearms or two-handers, but if you want to run fast, you're better off using those 2 points to maximize your one-handed skill. After taking care of your melee skills, pick a ranged weapon and assign a couple of focus points into its related skill, maybe even more. I personally put 2 points into crossbows in order to unlock the first 3 perks, which are the most useful. Anything beyond that is kind of a waste, but it all comes down to personal preference. As I've said at the beginning, you don't have to follow my build 100%. Before you maximize any skill, however, make sure you have 1 focus point invested into the following auxiliary skills. Riding, for the ability to mount war horses. Trade, if you would like to carry more loot and get better prices for it. Charm, to get a better bargain when dealing with lords. And Scouting, because you've already maximized cunning, might as well get some points into this skill to help you level up. It's kind of an auxiliary support skill, just like Tactics, which should already have a point into it if you've picked the same background options I have. And with that, we are pretty much done talking about my rogue build. That took a while, but then again, I can't just tell you, do this, do that, shut up, do what I say, without offering some sort of an explanation on why we do things this way. With that taken care of, we can now talk about how to best train our abilities. Some skills are more straightforward than others. You put 5 focus points into crossbows, snipe as many fools as you can and your sharpshooting will get better. Melee skills, same thing. Whack people over the head and you'll get better at whacking people over the head. Riding, do both of those things while riding a horse. Other skills are not as straightforward, but they're pretty easy to train once you've figured them out. For example, Stewardship is passively increased by ensuring that your soldiers enjoy a rich and varied diet as they march across the continent. And Smithing levels up as you unlock rare weapon designs and forge them into actual armaments. But other skills are neither intuitive nor easy to train, such as Leadership, which has many useful perks, including one that allows you to train bandit troops you've recruited into elite super soldiers who are capable of transforming a battlefield into a mass grave in mere seconds. I may be overselling their abilities, but the disciplinarian perk, it's now called Veterans Respect, is something I always recommend because elite troops are not easy to come by under normal circumstances. But let's actually talk about how to train this skill. There are many ways to slowly and steadily develop your leadership, But the best one is to either join an existing kingdom, which isn't something any self-respecting outlaw would ever consider, or establish your own faction when your clan reaches tier 4. Once that's done, all you have to do is use this button right here or the kingdom interface to assemble an army. Normally this would cost you influence, but if you go to the clan tab, create another party with one of your companions and give him some of your own troops, you'll be able to form an army with just your clanmate. The more people are riding alongside you, the more leadership experience you'll gain. And if you've done as I advised and put 5 focus points into this skill, you'll get the veterans' respect in no time. Besides, everything has a price. This one has to be the second most overpowered perk in the game, for reasons I've already explained. Another decent way of getting some leadership XP is to maintain your party's morale above 75. To do so, you have to provide your men with a varied diet and consistently win battles, but if you want a huge morale boost, you should lay siege to a settlement, preferably one with very few defenders, and when you win, devastate it. The former owner of that settlement, as well as any notables residing in it, will absolutely hate your guts for laying waste to their town. But as a raider, you probably won't be winning any Mr. Popularity contests anyway, so who gives a fuck what they think? Devastation is a wonderful way to raise the morale of your psychopathic troops, but should be avoided on a regular playthrough where long-term sustainability is the goal, because it will also destroy town projects, which you will then have to rebuild out of your own pocket. To my disappointment, devastation is nowhere near as rewarding as it should be. I mean, when this feature was introduced, I was expecting it to be an endgame moneymaker for a raider king, similar to how as a trader I could sell a conquered town for millions. But the payout for sacking an entire city is absolutely pathetic when you consider how much effort goes into a siege. Even caravan robberies are more lucrative than this. Anyway, we were talking about training your skills, weren't we? Let's get back to it. While some skills can be trained somewhat passively, others require your active involvement or they'll simply stagnate. Athletics and roguery are in this category, so let's talk about both of them. How about we start with the first? In the How to Learn section of the skill description, it's stated that you can develop your athletics if you travel the map on foot. I've done that when I was about level 150 and it took me 35 minutes of constant walking to level up once. If you want to go through that trouble, be my guest. But I recommend you mount a horse as you travel across the map and take a more proactive approach in training your athletics. So allow me to share my step-by-step method with you. Step number 1 is unburdening yourself of your heavy armor and any weapons except a one-handed sword. Or an axe, I don't discriminate. This isn't absolutely necessary, seeing how you can just throw your weapons around by pressing G. If you're trying to drop your shield though, make sure you hold the block before you press G, otherwise you'll just drop your one-handed weapon. As for removing your armor, if you don't like having a man butt on your screen, you can cover up with the lightest rags you can wear, or play a female character. The reason we wear light armor and drop our weapons is to keep this number as low as possible and get a slight boost to movement speed. Step number 2 is keeping an eye out for walking bags of experience, commonly known as looters or peasants. Doesn't matter as long as they're soft targets that fall within a couple of hits. Step number 3 only applies if you've chosen to travel the map on foot. Before a battle begins, go to your inventory and equip a horse. If you have no spare horses but you have some mounted troops in your party, whether they're companions or cavalry units, tell them to dismount and borrow one of their horses. Step number 4 is to unleash your soldiers until the moment victory is declared and the enemy starts running away. As soon as that happens, your athletics training begins. So tell your men to cease fire and stand down. Step number 5 is to ride your horse in front of the runners. Double tap W to accelerate, and once you've positioned yourself about 10 meters in front of the cowards, double tap S to quickly bring your horse to a halt. Then all you have to do is dismount and charge at the runners with your melee weapon. When you hit the enemy running towards you, you'll gain some athletics experience. Well, technically you gain experience even if you hit them as they're running away, but good luck catching them when you're low level. Early on you'll be too slow to chase them on foot, so what you'll do instead is go to your horse and repeat step 5 until the runners have evacuated the battleground. And that's how you farm athletics experience. It truly is harvesting season. This workout routine works especially great as you're squeezing a party of villagers. Each fight will give you a few athletics skill points at a time, and once you reach level 150, let's say, you'll be able to replace step 4 with an alternative. Instead of letting your soldiers do the fighting, tell them to hold their fire and stand back, ride towards the training dummies yourself, dismount, shoot them with a crossbow, throw javelins in their heads, slash them to pieces, and when they finally lose their morale, kill as many as you can while running towards your horse. Then mount up and repeat step 5 just like you did previously. Prior to patch 1.5.10, once you reached a certain athletics level, you did not need a horse anymore. You could catch up to the looters by chasing them on foot, but nowadays, that's nearly impossible. If you do chase a few people on foot, you need to remember that when you aim, block, or wind up an attack, your speed will decrease and you may miss your target. And you can also use this mechanic to your advantage to outrun your enemies. Now that my athletics is at 250, I feel somewhat comfortable fighting people on foot. I can easily outmaneuver 3 to 4 enemies charging at me, but if I'm fighting an entire horde, there's not much I can do to stem the tide, other than turn my back, run away, and hope for the best. Things were so much better in patch 1.5.9. Maybe that's the version I'll play on when my Raider playthrough makes its debut. Anyway, in order to make the most out of your movement speed, find yourself some armor with a nice balance between protection and weight. The Imperial Brigandine is probably the best choice, but now that I've named it, the devs will probably nerf it, just like they do with anything remotely balanced. Before we discuss the development of other skills, I need to talk about the athletic perks you need to unlock in case you took the time to train it. First of all, you gotta take everything that boosts your movement speed. Morning exercise, sprint, form-fitting armor. Then you gotta take strong and healthy citizens for a +1 to vigor and endurance respectively. These will slightly increase the learning rate of your athletics and one-handed skills, which work very well together when it comes to maximizing movement speed. Finally, there's some other, not as impactful but equally important perks. Having going for the +5 to party size, Walk It Off for improved healing while traveling, and at level 225 you can get strong legs, which actually come in handy during sieges, in case you need to parkour across castle walls without getting killed by terminal velocity. And as I've said, training athletics can take a while, but if you've devoted the time to grinding it, you will be slightly more effective in melee combat. But not without this perk in one-handed weapons. Training that skill will take you a long time, especially if you did not listen when I told you to use the one-handed weapons to harvest your athletics experience. If you did, then you trained it passively. But of course, attacking looters isn't the only way to train your athletics. It's only the most consistent, safe, and focused method of doing it. But if you feel confident in your fighting abilities, you can instead join the shield wall and fight your enemies on foot, alongside your men. Sieges, again, are a wonderful way of developing your skill, provided you survive long enough. Whether it's smacking defenders on the walls or shooting attackers with a ballista or throwing rocks on their heads, there's a lot of athletics experience to be gained from participating in a siege. And once you're able to move slightly faster than a paralyzed snail, you will be able to use your speed to train your roguery skill. How are these two skills related? All will become clear in due time. If we take the time to read the skill description for roguery, it's stated that this skill can be developed by raiding caravans, or peasants, or villages, but that, as well as the rest of the stuff on this list, isn't very effective. I mean, you get about 1,000 skill experience every time you raid a village, which takes about a day, but to go from 99 to 100 roguery, you need 5,000 experience, so that's not the best way to level up. Sure, if you are going to raid villages anyway, the XP is good, but if you want to develop your thievery to level 125 and get this perk, you're gonna have to put in some effort. The most consistent method of developing your banditry is to raid caravans, capture the survivors, and take them to the ransom broker. The higher the quality and quantity of prisoners you ransom, the more skill points you will gain. One time I even did something completely ridiculous which may or may not work for you. Let me tell you what I did. So I was walking around, minding my own business, when all of a sudden I spotted an Aserai army, 1,000 strong, laying siege to an imperial castle, and I kept my eye on them because they were interesting. As soon as the siege was over, their numbers started dwindling due to starvation, and I knew what they were going to do next. Go to one of their towns and restock their food reserves, so I got the genius idea to intercept them just before they walk through the gates. To do that, I paid attention to where they were traveling and I tried riding in front of them. As the army approached their closest town, an Imperial battalion built a blockade around it and pitched a siege camp, and because the Aserai were in no condition to fight, they changed course towards the city of Danustica, which was a lot further away. By the time they reached the gates, they only had 50 battle-ready troops and 800 wounded soldiers, and I was ready. My 120 riders made short work of their starving 50, and in one swift strike, I captured 830 soldiers. So I dragged those 800 into town, snuck in, went to the tavern and offered to sell these 700 men to the ransom broker. And just like that, I got 77,000 dinars for the 630 men I managed to ransom, along with 2 roguery skill points, which was a significant increase, seeing how I was already past level 130. Bottom line is, if you manage to pull that off, you can get a nice boost to your skill, as well as your wallet. But don't go out of your way to make it happen, just keep an eye open for such opportunities, and do not hesitate to jump in. You're better off raiding caravans and selling the survivors, as I've said earlier. Another decent way of giving your rogue skill a boost at the start of the game is to get some money, preferably through legitimate means, to avoid angering any of the factions, and then travel to each city and bribe your way into the keep. But while this is a pretty decent way of getting your first 50 levels or so, you can only do it once during your playthrough and only before your clan is tier 2. After that, you're considered a noble and you'll be allowed without having to bribe your way in, which sounds good in theory, but in practice prevents you from gaining some easy rogue XP. But the best way of developing your roguery is by doing an activity which successfully combines the last 3 things written in the How to Learn section of the skill description. Infiltrate towns, give bribes, escape from captivity. That activity is called a prison break. Just like we did with athletics, I will give you my step-by-step method for pulling this off. The first step is actually training your athletics, so it's more like the first million steps. Once you're confident you can handle yourself in close quarters, either buy or forge yourself a short sword and 3 sets of throwing knives, and equip them to your civilian attire. And if you're able to trade with an Imperial town, purchase yourself a thick Brigandine, because that is the best civilian armor money can buy. And as I said earlier, it also provides the best protection to weight ratio out of all the armors. So consider buying yourself one for your battle gear as well, because the lighter your armor, the faster you can move and you'll have an easier time training the running skill. Changing your civilian equipment like this is step number 2, by the way. Step number 3 is a bit weird, because you cannot bust someone out of prison if they're an enemy, so try to make peace with as many factions as possible. The reason this is a weird step is because the best way to train your raiding skill is to not be a raider. Anyway, step number 4 is opening your encyclopedia and checking each kingdom to see if they're at war with another faction. If, for example, the Khuzaites are in open conflict with the Aserai, ride to the war zone and visit each town on their borders. It's not uncommon for lords to fight each other and throw prisoners of war into their dungeons. So your job is to go to each town's keep, scout the dungeon and see if there's anyone inside, preferably not an enemy. If there is someone in there, you can stage a prison break, bribe a guard to let you in, and begin training your roguery. The prison break sequence doesn't last longer than a minute, but you'll mess it up in 10 seconds if I don't give you the few tricks that I've learned over the course of 100 failures. First of all, save your game. You don't know what you're about to face, and maybe you don't want to deal with the consequences of your failure. In my experience, all dungeons make you fight about 4 to 5 guards one by one, with the exception of Khuzaite dungeons, where you gotta fight 5 elite guards at the same time. Since I have no shield and I'm stuck in a cramped environment, that's a guaranteed defeat, but perhaps your experience will be different from mine. Anyway, from my observations, all kingdoms have their specific dungeon layout, with the same layout being used across all cities belonging to that faction. My favorite dungeon is the Imperial one, probably because that's where I had most success. So how do we do it? Well, it depends on whether you infiltrated a hostile city or you're doing this operation in a neutral town. Because if you snuck in, you'll be wearing a disguise instead of your Brigandine and you will be unarmored. Then you have to be aware of your weapons. I told you to prepare a good sword, preferably shorter in length so you can swing it in this claustrophobic environment, and a bunch of throwing daggers. Careful if you crafted those. You might pull a knife out, throw it into an enemy, and when you want to switch to your sword, you actually draw another knife and another, and before you've drawn your sword, you're lying on the floor in a pool of your own blood, because crafted daggers don't have the same stats and count as different weapons. But the thrown weapons are not an absolute necessity, they just give you a small damage boost so that you may hopefully down the enemy with just one swing of the sword. As for the fighting itself, here's what you need to expect when you pay the bribe and sneak into the dungeon. A cramped environment, several armored guards, and a moron with a death wish who charges at them with a knife instead of staying behind the guy with an actual weapon. If your retard does the same, walk backwards as much as you can to draw him back to you, and then take charge of the situation. But if he's already started to fight, there's nothing you can do to save him. Now, remember when I said about a minute ago that each faction has its specific dungeon layout? That layout includes the positions of the guards, which are pretty much fixed across all dungeons of the same type. What this means for you is that after you've learned a specific layout, you'll know where to expect the guards and prepare accordingly. As you can see, I prepared a throwing knife for this guard before I even entered the room. But you won't always know what to expect, so if you've heard or spotted a guard and you're sure he's solo, draw out your throwing knives and try to land a shot. Then switch to your sword and smack him over the skull. Overhead strikes work best, but do whatever you're able to. And pay attention to the environment. Sometimes your weapon may hit a wall or the ceiling. If that happens, do not repeat the same attack. Do pray that your opponent is not as smart. To elaborate on that, if your left shoulder is touching a wall, an attack coming from the left will get stuck in the wall, whereas an attack from the right will usually go unhindered. And if you're fighting an enemy with a spear or another lengthy weapon, get up close and slice him up. And do not bother using kicks or bashes or any advanced tactics because time is of the essence. You never know when reinforcements arrive or when the guard targets your ally and knocks him out. And if you're fighting 2 or more enemies, well, no amount of tips and tricks will help you save the prisoner because he's got a single track mind which is focused on aggression rather than self-preservation. So if you're facing impossible odds, the best you can hope for is to get yourself out of there. And if you're to achieve that, just get good at combat. Can't help you with that. Only thing I can advise is for you to try to use your mobility to evade enemy attacks and strike them back, one by one. So use the limited space you're in to the best of your ability to backtrack and get yourself some space. But if you get cornered, well, it's okay. You won't escape, but at the very least you will not be executed. You know, most likely. So basically the prison break has 3 outcomes. Total failure, where you get knocked out and thrown in a jail cell along with the person you are trying to rescue, which isn't all bad because even a failed prison break rewards more roguery experience than any other activity in the game. Partial failure or partial success, depending on your perspective, where the prisoner stays in prison but you manage to make your escape. This obviously rewards more XP. And total success, where you manage to safely escort the prisoner to his freedom, which greatly improves relations, boosts your charm skill, and rewards the most roguery experience in the game. I'm past level 150 and I still consistently earn 3 skill points for every successful prison break. I've also heard rumors of a 4th possibility where failing a rescue mission could cost you your head, but that's never happened to me. If it did, I'd probably not be here to talk about it. But there is another outcome that I would like to talk about which may not be obvious at first. If you're feeling particularly devious, you can sneak into the dungeons, pick anyone you'd like to save from his earthly struggles, and intentionally let him run into a guard's weapon. Sharp weapon, because if it's blunt, he'll just get knocked out, which is counterproductive to your assassination attempt. If the person you're trying to shank in prison is more resilient than you initially thought and somehow manages to survive the wardens, that's where the throwing daggers come into play. Prison assassination is perfect if you're trying to get rid of a political rival without executing him and losing standings with literally everyone. And this might be useful if your goal is to influence the results of an election. But you did not learn that from me, and if they catch on, I don't know you. Now, because from the lens of a prison break, an assassination is considered a partial failure, it won't reward you as many skill points as successfully extracting the prisoner, so only use it on people you really want gone. Preferably kings, since that can change the balance of power of an entire faction. Bonus points if you're part of that faction and you're next in line for the throne. While we're at it, if you're trying to hasten your king's ascension to heaven, you can join his army or follow it around, and when a battle starts, you can clumsily jab a javelin into the back of his skull. Just make sure it looks like an accident. But enough about politics, let's stay on topic. So why did we go through all that trouble to develop those skills? Well, I've already explained the importance of leadership, athletics, and other combat skills. But Roguery has a few perks that could make your raider experience a bit more pleasant. The most important of those is Scarface, which makes everyone 30% more likely to comply with your hostile actions. I've noticed that since obtaining this perk, peasants are less reluctant to unburden themselves of all the stuff they're carrying, bandits are more enthusiastic at the prospect of joining my gang, and the number of caravans who trust me with their cargo is at an all-time high. It's damn good for business. There's also this perk, which lets you know how to get more loot from raiding, and while Robbery's 100% loot gain makes this 5% bonus look pathetic, remember that not everybody surrenders their wares. This perk works best with a squeezing tactic discussed in part 1 or even looting actual armies, since they have a strict no surrender policy. And if you somehow manage to unlock the last perk, you'll get so much loot from the parties you're attacking that you will no longer need to use the raiding techniques I've shared in part 1, but it'll take you a while to get there. Until you do, let's talk about our more immediate needs, such as the need to sneak into hostile towns, which gets a lot easier if you bothered to unlock the Two-Faced perk. Its description states that it offers a 50% bonus in disguise missions, and on my first raider character, I actually thought that it's only useful for certain quests, so I took the other one, but that was a mistake on my part. Every time you sneak into town, that's considered a disguise mission, and without this perk, you will have no access to the taverns and dungeons of hostile towns. Other perks I recommend are No Rest for the Wicked and Promises, since we could use the faster raiding speed or faster bandit recruitment, so that's obvious. Finally, I want to talk about the perk named Smuggler Connections. This one slightly improves the effectiveness of your civilian armor, but most importantly, it greatly increases the price of your loot when selling it into a town where you've broken the law. Now, before we close this video, allow me to explain how the whole criminal justice system works and how to use these two perks to massively increase your profits. First of all, you cannot trade with a hostile town, as we've established earlier in this guide, so if you wish to use this tactic, you need to be on friendly terms with the faction you're trading. However, on friendly terms does not mean law-abiding citizen, so the next thing you want to do is slightly increase your criminal rating with this faction, but not to the point where they forbid you from entering their towns. To do so, simply look for a quest that asks you to break the law. Merchants can't sell goods or fencing stolen items. You accept this quest, you get approached by someone else who asks you to respect his authority, you say no, and boom, you now have some criminal rating. But be careful, because if this gets too high, you'll have to either pay a fine, or go to jail, or even pay with your blood. But if you do any of those things, you'll lose all criminal rating and therefore your bonus, so take care to keep it below 30. If you do not have such available quests, simply wait for a party of villagers belonging to this faction to get into town, and extort them, or even rob them, but if they put up a fight, let them go. You do not want to start a war with a faction you're trying to trade with. Since you're a Scarface, you might have an easier time convincing the peasants to willingly part with their goods, in which case, your criminal rating will increase. Once it does, head into the nearest market and enjoy higher prices. But only for weapons and armor pieces, because for some reason, the Smuggler perk does not affect the prices of trade goods or horses. If it did, I would have rushed to make a rogue trader build that combines his trade perks with Smuggler connections for maximum profit. Best you can do is hold on to the equipment you loot from battles until you're ready to trade with a neutral town, and when you're ready, break the law and enjoy better prices. This also works with rebel towns in case you've done like Ukzug and pissed off every major faction. And with that, I believe I've said all there was to say about creating the perfect rogue character. When I originally compiled this guide prior to version 1.5.10, athletics was the most important skill you could focus on because it turned you into a monster. So the guide was originally structured to reflect that, but I had to do some restructuring, because now athletics is a second-rate skill that is pretty okay, but it takes considerable effort to reach that level. If you want it, I gave you my methods to train it efficiently, but not everybody has the time or patience to actually grind skill points, so if you don't care about your movement speed, you can take the focus points you are going to invest into this skill and put them into riding, or even bows or crossbows. You don't need to outrun your enemy if you can outrange him. So to recap, create a character whose starting attributes are in line with your vision of a raider, put focus points into roguery, leadership and any other skills you want, and spend some time training them by using my methods. Roguery especially needs to reach level 150 in order for this build to reach its full potential, but the more you level it up, the more rewarding battles will be, especially against lords. Until you get to that stage, however, make sure to pillage the village, raid some caravan, get a lot of loot, smuggle it into a town, sell it for a ton of gold and use that money to fund your criminal enterprise. And when you feel ready, you may even establish a kingdom of your own, build a powerful army and set the world on fire from Dorne to Winterfell. I may have some knowledge to share about troops and late-game bandit strategies, but this video has been going on long enough, so I better see you in part 3 of this raider guide. Thanks for watching and goodbye.